Frank Dawson, a 78-year-old veteran, thought nothing could shake him, until the HOA slapped him with a $2,500 fine for the wheelchair ramp he needed to leave his own house. At the center of this mess, Margaret Swanson, a ruthless HOA president, who had turned neighborhood rules into a money-making scheme, preying on the elderly to line her husband's pockets. But what she didn't expect was Frank's grandson Ryan digging into her shady deals and exposing the corruption for the whole town to see. And when the dust settled, justice wasn't just served, it was delivered with a brand new steel-reinforced ramp and a one-way ticket for Margaret out of the neighborhood. Frank Dawson had lived in this house for 40 years. He had moved in with his wife, Helen, back when their son was just a toddler. Together, they had built a life here, raised a family, planted a garden, watched their grandchildren chase fireflies in the backyard. Even after Helen passed away a few years back, Frank stayed. This house, this street, this neighborhood, it was home. And home was supposed to be a place of comfort, not a battlefield. But as he sat on his porch that morning, clutching a thick envelope from the HOA, Frank had the uneasy feeling that his home had just turned into enemy territory. He slid a rough, calloused finger under the envelope's seal and pulled out the letter inside. The paper was heavy, expensive, the kind designed to intimidate, legal-looking. His tired eyes scanned the page until they landed on the section labeled Amount Due. And there it was, $2,500. Frank blinked, his fingers tensed around the paper. A fine? For what? His gaze dropped lower, skimming past the dry, bureaucratic jargon. Violation, unauthorized exterior modification offense, unapproved structural addition. Description, non-compliant wooden ramp attached to front entryway, the wheelchair ramp. Frank's heartbeat slowed, then thudded hard against his ribs. For a long moment, he just stared at the words, as if his mind refused to process them. They were fining him, threatening him, over a damn accessibility ramp, a ramp that had been there for years, a ramp that wasn't flashy or intrusive, just a simple wooden structure leading from his front door to the sidewalk, built so he wouldn't have to risk his life navigating his old porch steps on unsteady legs. And now, according to this letter, it was a violation. He took a slow breath, steadying the storm brewing inside him. This had to be a mistake. There had been no warnings, no previous notices, no complaints, just this letter, this absurd fine, and a threat of legal action if he didn't comply. His jaw tightened as he read the last few lines. Failure to comply within 30 days will result in daily fines and potential legal action. Legal action. For fixing his own damn house so he wouldn't break his hip stepping outside. A slow burning heat crawled up his spine. Frank exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his weathered face. For a second, he considered the possibility that this was just some clerical error. Maybe a new HOA officer didn't know he had a medical exemption. Maybe this was just a stupid mix-up, but something nagged at him. The HOA had always been strict, but they weren't stupid. They wouldn't issue a $2,500 fine without being sure they could enforce it, which meant this wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. Frank slowly folded the letter, setting it down on the small table next to his untouched cup of coffee. His fingers tightened into a fist. This was his home. He had paid his mortgage, followed the rules, served his country, and paid his dues to this community. And now they wanted to extort him over something as essential as a ramp for his own safety? The absurdity of it all sent a bitter chuckle rumbling from his chest. They really thought he was just going to roll over and take it? That was the thing about fighting in a war, about surviving as long as he had. It taught you that some battles were worth standing your ground for. And this was one of them. Frank Dawson wasn't the kind of man who asked for help. He had fought in a war, buried a wife, raised a son on his own. He knew how to handle problems, but this was beyond ridiculous. He sat on his porch that afternoon, the HOA letter resting on his lap like a bad omen. The words printed on that crisp, expensive paper had been circling in his head all day, each line pushing his patience closer to the edge. A $2,500 fine for a damn wheelchair ramp. He read it again, his jaw tightening with each word. His hands, scarred and stiff with age, flexed around the paper. His morning coffee sat untouched beside him, long gone cold. And then, the familiar sound of tires crunching on gravel pulled him from his thoughts. A black pickup truck rolled into the driveway, and out stepped his grandson, Ryan Dawson. Sharp-eyed, broad-shouldered, and carrying the kind of confidence only someone in their 20s could have. Ryan had made it a habit to stop by after work a couple of times a week, always bringing takeout from that greasy burger joint Frank secretly loved but never admitted to craving. But today, the moment Ryan caught sight of his grandfather's face, his easygoing expression shifted. Something was wrong. Ryan climbed the porch steps, setting the brown paper bag on the table. "What's up, Grandpa?" he asked, his voice casual but his eyes searching. Frank didn't answer right away. Instead, he picked up the HOA letter, folded it once with deliberate slowness, and handed it to Ryan. Ryan unfolded it, scanning the contents. The confusion hit first, his eyebrows knitted together, then his lips pressed into a tight line. By the time he reached the bottom of the letter, his grip had tightened around the paper. A slow, controlled breath left his nose, controlled but furious. "Are they serious?" he muttered. Frank let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Apparently, it's an unauthorized modification," he said, leaning back in his chair. His voice was calm, but there was steel underneath it. "Guess I should have filed paperwork before my legs decided to give out on me." Ryan's jaw flexed. He looked back at the letter as if expecting it to suddenly rewrite itself into something less absurd, but it didn't. And that's when his grip on the paper tightened further. "This is bullshit," he muttered. Without another word, he yanked his phone out of his pocket and scrolled to the number at the bottom of the letter. "Ryan," Frank warned, but his grandson had already pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before a clipped, professional voice answered. "Springdale HOA office. This is Margaret Swanson, HOA president. How can I help you?" Ryan didn't bother with pleasantries. "Yeah, hi. My grandfather just received a ridiculous fine for his wheelchair ramp. I want to know why." A pause on the other end, then a slow, exaggerated sigh. "That ramp," Margaret's voice came smooth, condescending, "was built without proper approval. It does not comply with HOA aesthetic standards." Ryan's free hand curled into a fist. "It's a wheelchair ramp," he said, his voice flat, cold. "Are you seriously telling me he needs permission to not be trapped inside his own home?" Margaret didn't miss a beat. "Rules are rules," she said, like she had rehearsed this answer. "Your grandfather needs to submit an application, go through the proper review process, and wait for approval. Until then, the fine stands." Ryan let out a sharp breath, nostrils flaring. "And if he doesn't pay?" Margaret's voice took on a syrupy sweetness. "Further legal action may be pursued." And then, without waiting for a response, she ended the call. Ryan pulled the phone away from his ear slowly, staring at it like he was trying to burn a hole through the screen. Then he turned to his grandfather. Frank was already watching him, one eyebrow raised, the ghost of a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Ryan exhaled, shoving his phone back into his pocket. "We're not letting them get away with this." Frank nodded, his old military instincts kicking in. "Damn right, we're not." Ryan Dawson had always been a calculated thinker. He wasn't the kind of guy to lose his temper over little things. But this wasn't a little thing. This was a full-blown scam, one that targeted the most vulnerable people in the neighborhood, and the more he dug, the worse it got. Sitting at his kitchen table, he had his laptop open, a notepad filled with angry scribbles, and his phone buzzing every few minutes with new messages from public records, databases, and legal sites. The HOA's sudden crackdown on Frank's ramp wasn't some random enforcement of an old rule. It was part of a pattern. The first red flag, the construction company. A few months back, Springdale HOA had signed an exclusive contract with a private firm called Adaptive Living Solutions, a company that specialized in accessibility renovations. Sounded nice on paper. Until Ryan dug a little deeper. The owner? Michael Swanson, as in Margaret Swanson's husband. Ryan sat back in his chair, rubbing a hand down his face. Well, that explained a hell of a lot. The second red flag, the violations. He started combing through HOA complaints, local housing reports, and public records, and that's when the pattern became obvious. In the last 4 months, the HOA had issued twice as many fines as the previous 2 years combined. Almost all the violations were against elderly residents or homeowners with disabilities, and conveniently, every one of these fines came with a suggested solution, hiring adaptive living solutions to correct the issue. Ryan exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of his laptop. It was a goddamn racket. Margaret and her crooked board members were shaking down elderly homeowners, slapping them with absurd fines for violations, then steering them straight into the arms of her husband's company. Pay the fine or pay my husband. Either way, you lose. Ryan's jaw clenched so hard it ached. His grandfather wasn't just a victim of overzealous HOA rules. He was being extorted. And he wasn't the only one. Ryan leaned back in his chair, staring at the mess of notes and documents spread across his table. This wasn't just some HOA power trip. This was fraud. And if these snakes thought they could bully his grandfather, they were about to find out just how badly they'd miscalculated. The next morning, Ryan pulled into his grandfather's driveway, a folder thick with evidence in one hand and 2 cups of coffee in the other. Frank was already on the porch, watching him with that familiar, knowing smirk, a cigarette between his fingers. Ryan climbed the steps and handed him a coffee. Frank took a sip, then nodded toward the stack of papers in Ryan's hand. "So, I'm guessing you found something," he said, his voice dry but amused. Ryan let out a humorless chuckle. "Oh yeah, and you're gonna love this." He dropped the folder on the table and flipped it open, pointing to the name at the top of one of the documents. Michael Swanson. Frank squinted at the name, then back at Ryan. "Swanson, as in—" "Yep," Ryan confirmed, crossing his arms. "Margaret's husband. He owns a company that does accessibility renovations, the same company the HOA just happened to sign a contract with a few months ago." Frank let out a low whistle, leaning back in his chair. "Well, ain't that a kick in the teeth?" Ryan wasn't done. He tapped another page. "This is a list of all the fines they've issued in the last 4 months, every single one of them, elderly or disabled homeowners. And guess what? They all got suggestions to hire Margaret's husband's company." Frank took another sip of coffee, then set the cup down. "So, let me get this straight," he said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "They fine old folks, tell them their homes are out of compliance, and then conveniently offer them a hand-picked contractor to fix the problem?" Ryan nodded slowly. "Exactly." Frank let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "And here I thought HOA was just a bunch of busybodies who didn't like long grass." "Nope," Ryan said, his voice hardening. "This isn't about rules. It's about money." Frank grinned, and this time it wasn't the tired smile of an old man. It was the sharp, knowing grin of a soldier who had just figured out exactly where to aim. Ryan met his gaze, fire in his own eyes. "We're taking these bastards down," Frank exhaled, stretching his fingers like a man who was getting ready for a fight. "Damn right we are." Ryan wasn't just angry anymore, he was on a mission. He had always been the kind of guy who stood up for the people he cared about. But this wasn't just about his grandfather anymore. This was bigger. Frank was just one of many who had been caught in Margaret Swanson's predatory scam, and if the HOA thought they could keep getting away with this, they were about to get a very rude awakening. Ryan spent the next 48 hours in full-blown investigator mode. His living room looked like a detective's office, papers, documents, and highlighter-marked HOA policies spread across the table. His laptop was running so many open tabs it sounded like it was about to take off. Every piece of information led to something worse. The contract between the HOA and Adaptive Living Solutions, signed in secrecy, the timing of the fines, started right after the contract was finalized. The people getting fined, mostly elderly and disabled residents. The suggested solution in every case, hire Adaptive Living Solutions, Margaret Swanson's husband's company. It was a rigged game from the start. Margaret had weaponized HOA rules to shake down the most vulnerable homeowners, knowing most of them wouldn't fight back. But she picked the wrong damn family this time. Ryan compiled everything. Emails between HOA members discussing aggressive enforcement. Financial records showing kickbacks from Adaptive Living Solutions to Margaret. Testimonies from other affected homeowners who had been forced to pay up. It wasn't just neighborhood drama anymore. It was criminal fraud. And Ryan was about to drop it like a bomb. Ryan triple-checked every document. Then, with one deep breath, he hit send. The emails went to 3 places: an attorney specializing in HOA fraud, so they could start preparing legal action; a local news station, because nothing gets HOA scumbags to sweat faster than public exposure; the state housing authority, so the entire corrupt board could be put under investigation. Then, he waited. For the first few days, nothing. Then, all hell broke loose. By the end of the first week, the HOA was officially placed under investigation. By week 2, the local news had picked up the story, and suddenly, everyone in town knew exactly what the HOA had been doing. Margaret Swanson tried to do damage control, but there was no spinning this. People were furious. It was all over the news. Local HOA caught in corrupt fining scheme. President linked to shady construction deal. Disabled homeowners targeted in HOA fraud scandal. Springdale HOA under state investigation. Possible legal action pending. And the cherry on top? A state investigator showed up at the HOA's next board meeting with subpoenas in hand. The entire board sat there, sweating bullets, as they realized the game was over. Margaret Swanson was forced to resign on the spot. Her husband's company lost its contract immediately, and the HOA, it was left in financial ruins, facing multiple lawsuits from the very people they had tried to rob. When Ryan told Frank the news, the old man just chuckled, taking a long sip of coffee on his porch. "Well, ain't that a kick in the teeth," he mused. But the best part? A veterans organization caught wind of Frank's story. They reached out, offering to help. Instead of just letting him keep his old ramp, they tore it down and rebuilt it better than ever. The new ramp was sturdy, steel reinforced, with proper railings, an anti-slip surface, and even a covered entryway. It wasn't just a ramp anymore. It was a symbol, a reminder that no matter how big or corrupt the enemy, sometimes the little guy wins. On a crisp Saturday morning, Frank sat on his brand new ramp, a cold beer in hand, watching something truly satisfying. Across the street, a moving truck pulled away from Margaret Swanson's house. She had been forced to sell her home, unable to stay after the public disgrace and lawsuits. Ryan stood beside his grandfather, arms crossed, watching her drive away with a smirk. "Well, Grandpa," Ryan said, grinning, "guess they won't be bothering you anymore." Frank took a slow sip, letting the moment sink in. Then with a small, satisfied nod, he exhaled. "Guess not."